Hello, and welcome to the final episode of the first season of Readapted, where we take a work and explore why we keep telling the same story over and over and over. I'm your host, Chris Pepper Hambrick. If you're listening to this, then you've probably been listening for a while, so I don't need to tell you what this season has been about. But I did want to spend one final episode pulling these threads together and discussing what, if any, conclusions we can draw from the 100+ years of Phantom history thus far, as well as tying up any loose ends. A fair warning, this episode is going to be a little looser than those in the past, as I move through various points I want to make sure I hit before we leave this book. So if you've been with me from the beginning, I realize it's been a while due to the fact I have to make a living and all of that, so I'm going to briefly recap what we've touched on in previous episodes. We started with The Book, a then little heralded French novel by Gaston Leroux, originally serialized in 1909 and translated into English in 1911. This novel drew from Gothic tradition as well as Victor Hugo-style empathy for the disadvantaged to create a main character with a curious mix of villainy and pathos in Eric, the titular Phantom. We are also introduced to ingenue Christine and her would-be boyfriend/fiancé, the Vicomte Raoul de Chanier. Eric's crimes range from being awkward to kidnapping to murder, but we are never allowed to forget that he is also a product of the society into which he was born. This novel was made into a film in 1925, A Vehicle for Lon Chaney directed by Rupert Julian. While silent, it preserved a great deal of the original story, while excising most of the sympathy for Eric, except for what Chaney could bring with his excellent performance. Meanwhile, in China, Song at Midnight begins an ongoing string of films with their own take on this story, where an injured Chinese opera star woos his lost love through another, sort of Cyrano de Bergerac style. The original film spawned a sequel, and many remakes, including The Phantom Lover, all of which squarely place our sympathies with the disfigured genius. Thus begins the two strands of the adaptation path, Eric as villain and Eric as sympathetic victim. Back in Hollywood, Phantom gets a reboot with Universal in 1943, when Claude Rains plays Eric Clodin, unconsciously copying the Chinese version in that he plays a musician who suffers a facial injury later in life and retreats to the shadows. This film begins the revenge tragedy variant of the story for Western cinema. This Phantom has our sympathy, but mostly because he's reduced from villain to victim, who then lashes out, and not because we as humans owe him humanity, regardless of his actions. Further, on the father/lover relationship scale established by the original, this one falls much more on the paternal side than the erotic. All of these trends are furthered in 1962 by the British Hammer production starring Herbert Lom and directed by Terence Fisher. In this version, two new characters are introduced who contain most of the quote-unquote evil tendencies originally held by the Phantom. Lom's Professor Petrie is a relatively harmless father/teacher figure who has been driven underground by outside machinations. Meanwhile, a nefarious nobleman is inserted to steal the Phantom's music and menace Christine, while a henchman carries out the Phantom's unconscious whims without being overtly directed. This Phantom is now entirely to be pitied. While to my knowledge he's never acknowledged the debt in interviews, Brian De Palma's Phantom of the Paradise is a clear update of the '62 film, in that his Phantom, now named Winslow, is again the hapless victim of a musical impresario, Swan. This is the first and, to this date, only notable modern retelling, and the story is far more about creative versus commercial success than it is about the relationships. In the mid-1970s, Ken Hill mounts his musical version, inspiring Andrew Lloyd Webber's 1986 blockbuster musical, running somewhere in the world this very minute. Pandora's box is open, and from this point forward, Phantom is a phenomenon. At times, he returns to the horror genre, and we get 1989's Dwight Little movie starring Robert Englund, 1998's Dario Argento film with the late Julian Sands, and a host of references in such places as Phantom of the Mall, the Wishbone TV show, Disney's Phantom of the Megaplex, and the R.L. Stine Goosebumps series with Phantom of the Auditorium. But the main thrust of the story has changed in the wake of Michael Crawford's musical Phantom. The Phantom is now overtly, unapologetically, textually sexy. And also notably, his physical anomalies generally revert to being congenital and existing from birth. By the time we get to Lloyd Webber's later iterations of his own work, the 2004 film and later sequel musical, the Phantom is clearly the main character, and there's not really any question whose side we're on or who we want to get the girl. From an antagonist afflicted from birth with unusual features to almost asexual victim injured in the course of his musical pursuits, all the way to a quite sexual almost lead, The story of Phantom in adaptation isn't exactly a straight line with no deviations, but I would say that in general we can draw two conclusions from its trajectory. One, the Phantom has gotten sexier. Or perhaps it's more accurate to say, portrayals of the Phantom have explicitly invited audience desire. Two, the empathy a work shows the Phantom, post-LaRue, is dependent on either his victimization or his desirability, but requires one of those things to be activated. In my opinion, these are the two ways in which the story has departed thematically from the original novel, in which LaRue does not paint Eric as innocent or victimized, and clearly does not overtly sexualize him, but nevertheless asks us to pity and have sympathy for him because of society's part in creating would-be monsters. There's a limited way in which I think we can draw conclusions about culture and society from this, especially inasmuch as it mirrors changes in other cultural touchstones, some of which we'll probably explore in future seasons. For example, Eric getting a bit of a glow-up isn't out of line with a general trend in, say, Dracula portrayals, or the shift in tone from Creature from the Black Lagoon to The Shape of Water. Importantly, it's not that vampires or swamp creatures or phantoms were ever not the locus of sexual concern or desire. It's often the entire point of them. But I do think what has changed over the past century plus is a more upfront acknowledgement that these sexual quote-unquote threats are not merely external and unwanted, but also indicative of our own sexual desires and needs. To put it another way, they were always sexualized, but the threat these days is more likely to be acknowledged as a promise or a fantasy. Some people always preferred the beast to the prince. It's just that our media today is more apt to come out and say it. What is less certain is what I would call the empathy trajectory in adaptations of Phantom. There's definitely a difference in the amount and type of sympathy the novel and various film and stage versions show Eric. But there are too many moving pieces here to generalize about, for instance, the amount of empathy society feels it owes the unfortunate in different eras. It depends on a lot of factors. Is the Phantom redeemed, or does he remain unrepentant to the end? Does he act simply out of antisocial malice and self-interest, or is he motivated by explicit wrongs? How much does he actually deceive Christine or the others with whom he interacts? Finally, how much leeway does an audience give him simply because he's sexy? None of this seems inherently dependent on cultural shifts, despite the general sense I think most of us have that we've gotten better, in air quotes, about treating people with respect, recent developments notwithstanding. I think this is especially stark given my conviction that no version of this story is actually as inherently compassionate and, dare I say, progressive, in a social sense, as the original LaRue novel. As clumsy as his author's foreword and epilogue are, they serve a function largely missing from the later versions. That of a conscience, guiding the reader not only through the twists and turns of plot, but through the ethics of condemning a man without acknowledging the ways in which society creates its own villains. This, to me, feels far more down to who LaRue was as a person and how his experiences shaped him than anything to do with Paris in 1910 or Hollywood in 2004. And that makes it, in essence, a problem of adaptation itself. As I've explored over the past episodes, I do think certain plot and moral elements can be traced to local conditions, but this larger question cannot be put into a coherent framework. There will always be people who see the world in black and white, and people who see shades of gray. And it's a lot easier to put an editorial message in a work written by one person than in one that is not only meant for the masses, and by necessity marketable to said masses, but requiring far more people and money to create. By virtue of the medium, a book is going to have a higher likelihood of having a singular message. But aside from that, this does touch upon a few other basic elements which have never, at least successfully, been worked into an adaptation, and that may have played a role in how the Phantom has been seen. Apart from any societal or ethical concerns, once you remove the story from a novel, you've removed, ostensibly, the authorial voice. Because none of the films has a narrator or omniscient voice, beyond any way in which the camera serves to guide our journey, no later iteration has a Gaston Leroux figure telling us what to think or feel. This is most likely an advantage in an artistic sense, but it automatically removes the explicit suggestion that there's more to how we should feel than what is presented. To be fair, a few versions include a Daroga-like character, Madame Giry in the Lloyd Webber play/film, or Eric's father played by Burt Lancaster in the 1990 television movie. Both of these provide some backstory that is meant to point out the ways Eric has been wronged by the world. But it's telling that most versions do not have a Persian at all, and certainly not one who knows all the Phantom's secrets and holds some regard for him despite it all. The closest we get is Ledoux in the silent movie, and we get no context at all for his presence beyond the fact he's a police inspector. In the end, I think that the film and stage adaptations are far more interested in entertaining the audience than asking what any of this means. And certainly, LaRue was also here to entertain and make a buck. But the possibility of compassion is not a necessary part of the plot and thus does not require adaptation. The way this story is changed in adaptation does mean something, but the elements of the novel that need to be pulled into the new version are more likely to include plot, setting, and character. Concrete narrative elements rather than editorializing. And in so doing, motivations and even the ethics of characters can change, to the end that in many versions the final redemption is not even attempted. The very meaning of a story can be upended without anyone saying it shouldn't have the same title. As I hope this entire season, and as we go on, series, illustrates, there are a lot of factors that go into adaptation. Some of them have to do with the medium, how you adapt words on a page to sounds and images and, yes, words on a stage or screen. Some have to do with changing mores and interests. Some have to do with the culture, language, or country into which you're bringing that story. And some simply have to do with the individual interests, biases, and hobby horses of the creator or creators. I do think we can draw a few other general conclusions from this exploration of phantoms through time and culture, so I'm going to go through a few of them now. First, I want to return to a quote I mentioned early on from Marina Warner's book From the Beast to the Blonde. In it, she posits that, quote, "At first, the beast is identified with male sexuality which must be controlled or changed, but later the beast is perceived as a principle of nature within every human being, and the stories affirm beastliness's intrinsic goodness and necessity for holistic survival." This tracks with a lot of what we see in the versions of Eric who remains sexual. Depending on how you interpret LaRue, his sexuality is a threat to Christine's purity, her innocence, possibly even her westernness. Like Dracula or Svengali, Eric is a vaguely Eastern threat who must be stopped so that the maiden can marry her age and culturally appropriate up-and-coming white boyfriend. Unlike those stories, Eric actually has a heart that can be touched, and in later versions, like Dracula, his sexuality is transformed into more of a struggle within. Whether you identify with him or with Christine, the Lloyd Webber stage version allows you license to imagine this union as a romance rather than a straight-up abduction. The phantom sexuality is possibly still a threat, but it's a more ambiguous one that raises questions about our own needs rather than about foreign invaders. And this highlights another general trend, which is that I believe the subsequent versions have made it easier to actually identify with Eric than in LaRue or the silent film. Whether it's because they make him explicitly a victim or, later, create a character with an attractive veneer of sensuality and intrigue, I do believe later versions of this story invite a greater affinity with the title character, which makes sense when you consider its also widening popularity and reach. And on a related note, the further we get from LaRue, the more the original class issues alter. This is natural given the way our perception of class has changed over the past 100 years, but what I mean is that in the original, Raoul is a heroic aristocrat, and Eric represents the dissipated aristocracy of the Gothic era. See also the most recent Nosferatu by Robert Eggers. In later tellings, Raoul is more likely to be portrayed as out of touch, boring, or even dissipated himself, while Eric becomes the self-made man. The outcast is now the viewpoint character. After all, the whole reason for the Danse Macabre or Death in the Maiden genre was to remind us that, in the end, we all contain a skeleton. Maybe more of us are comfortable with that these days. In a way, this also ties in with how Phantom has always linked so-called high and low art. Opera and carnival are twinned in the original, not to mention serialized proto-pulp fiction. In early Hollywood, the tension was between big-budget and lowbrow genre offerings. In Lloyd Webber, the pseudo-opera patina contrasts with the accessible hummability of his radio-friendly tunes. All the way through, in various guises, the original Eric's pretensions to a middle-class life are preserved, along with the highfalutin trappings of the opera setting, a consistent attraction for many audiences who wish to understand what they're seeing, but also feel like they're getting something classy in the bargain. There's one last thread I want to bring up, which has been here the whole time. We haven't really talked about it much because it's so inherent to the premise that I haven't questioned it nearly as much as it deserves, and that is the continued exploitation of Eric's physical anomalies for shock value. Most versions make hay out of the unmasking, and audiences are waiting for that moment and in part judging the production by how horrifying the makeup is. But isn't this what's pointed out as problematic in the text? A text which, by the way, is also exploiting this, but doesn't do so in a visceral, visual sense. Can these creators simultaneously exploit his appearance and ask us to empathize and condemn the character's exploitation? No matter how empathetic we are to Eric's plight or how attracted we are to him, a person's appearance is made central to his entertainment value. There is a reason this story is anathema to many in the community with various facial anomalies, and no amount of sympathy for a fictional character is going to address the reality of that pain. Because in the end, it's a horror story, and the locus of that horror is, in part, a man's face. And that face is linked, if not to outright villainy or evil, at the very least to something to be feared or pitied. Just as societal norms about the exploitation of a person's appearance or disability for entertainment have mercifully changed, another huge factor in the continued life of Phantom of the Opera has to do with our changing understanding and increased conversation about consent. While kidnapping and manipulating a potential romantic partner was never okay, this story in most iterations relies on a lie told to an impressionable young person who is then tricked into becoming trapped in the impenetrable lair of a murderous madman, and then forced to choose between an unwanted marriage, and presumably sexual relationship, and her life and the life of everyone around her. While that story has not changed, our tolerance for this type of tale does seem to have waned over the years. Trawling through various online forums devoted to musical theater, for example, a lot of comments about Phantom describe the plot and character as icky and use words such as grooming and problematic. After all, the immense popularity of the Twilight series also came with a large cultural conversation about the way in which certain power dynamics, heavily represented in so-called romance stories, are not ideal in real life. It seems much of that discourse has spilled over into the way younger generations see this story, untouched by nostalgia or hype. Over the years, we've watched creators tackle what parts of Phantom to adapt and keep. In some cases, the adaptation seems to clearly be riffing off the adaptations that came before, until someone, like Lloyd Webber for example, goes back to the original source material and pulls out other elements. We've seen how authorial voice and opinion is subsumed to the authority of the camera, and what it shows you being presented as, and assumed to be, reality. We've seen studios disagree with the notion that a criminal can ever be redeemed, and we've seen studios assume that criminals can't engender audience sympathy, so we'd best make our title character the victim. We've seen the audience's imagination called upon in different ways from reading a book, when the music and the face and the other murky elements of the narration become things we can actually see and hear. And we've seen several different takes on the late 1800s as viewed through the lens of subsequent eras. All of these elements and changes say something about the original work and about the time and people responsible for the various versions. Hopefully, I've unpacked many of those factors in the previous episodes, though I acknowledge there are many iterations I did not, for the sake of time and medium, touch. So what is coming next, if anything, for the Phantom of the Opera? Does the current conversation about consent render this story too creepy to be fun? We'll see. A project connected to Universal's Dark Universe imprint announced in 2017 was shelved when Alex Kurtzman left the project. Presumably, it would have centered the darker elements, and my guess is that it would not downplay the sexuality. But as of September 2024, a project described as a young adult adaptation was announced as in development for Disney Plus, of all things. Which, given that director Kenny Ortega is known for things like Newsies and High School Musical, will probably be focused on the musical aspects and make the romance much more young adult friendly. What is certain to me is that we are not done with this story, despite the current tendency to see Eric's actions as simply creepy. While others, such as Dwight Little and Dario Argento, have attempted to explore Christine's possible attraction to the Phantom, they are still of an era where we weren't especially good at having that conversation. My hope for an adult Phantom would be to fully commit to both the creepy and sexy aspects of this and explore it. Or possibly even go back to the original novel and tell a more streamlined, but more morally complicated story. My dream is a story that accepts Eric's villainy and his sympathy, and makes his appearance a cause of society's rejection of him rather than a symbol of his own evil. But something will come, because every few years, even if it doesn't happen, another movie is announced. A new ballet opened in Shanghai in 2023 with the plot involving both Raoul and Christine as dancers. Endless books are published all the time as sequels or rewrites of this story, not to mention the fact that it's lunchtime on February 24th as I write this, and 9 stories have been posted or updated on Archive of Our Own so far today under the Phantom tag. I don't think this story is going anywhere. It's got a hold on several generations now, and the mix of sex, death, art, spectacle, and exploitation are potent ones. In an era of artistic and successful Nosferatu remakes and the increasing self-identification of audience members as, shall we say, monster curious, the Phantom will return. And I hope it does. There's a reason I started this podcast with the Phantom, and that reason is that I will always love this story and welcome new versions. I fully recognize all of the problematic aspects as well as the many not very good versions of it, but something in me will always thrill to it. Possibly because of some of those problematic aspects, because that's just how humans work sometimes. This story spoke to something in me at the age of 14, which, okay, ew, but I came out alright. The mix of romance and death and music and passion and exotic locations and wrong geniuses still gets me, and I think we're all capable of holding multiple truths at once. Plus, the Persian is one of my favorite characters in anything ever, and I will stand by that. So part of me will also always return to it, warts and all. And speaking of returning, a few words before I leave you about what's coming up. I have a lot of ideas for future series and seasons. There is a full list of things I'm thinking about on the blog section of my website, but at the top of that list are Sherlock Holmes, Dracula, and Robin Hood. But I would love your input. Perhaps I should sprinkle in shorter seasons between the big ones. I also in future hope to have fewer gaps between episodes that belong together. If there are any other suggestions or criticisms or things you'd like me to know, please get in touch. On that note, while I do not ever expect to make any money off of this podcast, I do have a few ideas for a Patreon or Patreon-like option, chief among them doing commentaries for the films I talk about in the main episodes. There's a lot of research and trivia about all of these movies that doesn't make it into the episode proper, so an audio file you could watch along with Lon Chaney or Herbert Lom might be fun. But again, I am open to suggestions. What would you like to hear or see in addition to what I'm already doing? Please let me know what you think about the show or the ideas I've just mentioned, and in the meantime, please spread the word about this show. There really is no other way for me to spread this to more people than by word of mouth, and I really appreciate those of you who have taken the time to reach out to me or tell people about this podcast. So until next season, thank you for listening to Readapted. This show was written and produced by me, Chris Pepper Hambrick. If you like the show, please rate and review and tell your friends. And feel free to contact me at readaptedpodcast at Gmail, Facebook, or Instagram, or readaptedpod on Twitter with comments, questions, and suggestions. Transcripts and sources are available on my website, readaptedpodcast.com. Until next time, I am not really wicked. Love me and you shall see. All I wanted was to be loved for myself. See you then.